The message came at 9:02 a.m. A calendar invite from the CEO himself. Lunch at Bellamy's on Harbor Street. Private table. No context, no agenda. Just a polite note from Marlon Avery, the man who once told me I was the most critical hire in the company's history. I had a feeling in my gut, not the anxious kind but the kind you get right before a fire alarm goes off. Something was wrong, and I already knew what it was. If this made your blood boil already, type justice in the comments. My name is Malcolm Reeve. I'm 44 years old, and for the last 12 years I was the tech brain behind Aerowen Dynamics, a mid-size aerospace firm based in Tacoma. When I joined, they were still printing invoices on carbon paper and using dial-up to transmit maintenance records. It took me 2 years to digitize the entire fleet maintenance system and another 3 to create a proprietary software suite that predicted aircraft part failures before they happened. I didn't just work for Aerowen, I quietly built its nervous system. I wasn't part of the leadership team in name, but every major contract signed in the last 6 years had my fingerprints on it. When the Navy approved our multi-million-dollar logistics contract, it was my predictive module that gave us the edge. I trained every junior developer, every analyst, every operations tech. But when you're silent, consistent and not flashy, your value becomes invisible until someone younger and louder shows up with a degree from Stanford and a last name that opens doors. Lunch at Bellamy's was the kind of performative grace Marlon Avery loved. Expensive steaks and quiet firings. He wore a navy blazer-like armor and started the conversation with compliments about legacy and contributions. I knew the script before he opened his mouth. "We're restructuring the tech division," he said, slicing into a ribeye that cost more than my team's entire weekly lunch budget. "The board's nephew, Callum Drake, will be leading the new digital vision. Fresh ideas. Big energy." I nodded, the kind of nod that buys you time while your mind runs 10 simulations per second. "When do we announce it?" I asked. His shoulders relaxed. He'd expected a fight. "End of the month. You'll help with the transition. We'll make it smooth." I smiled and took a sip of water. Of course, these things happen. But inside something ancient stirred. Because what Marlon didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd seen this coming for months. The first hint had come from a systems access log. A credential request that didn't match any known profile. Someone had been rummaging through my sandbox environment. The section of the code I never documented. The part where the real magic lived. They weren't just replacing me. They were studying me, extracting me, and they thought I wouldn't notice. When I got back to the office that afternoon, my name had already vanished from the department-wide email loop. My admin credentials still worked, but barely. I couldn't access the sandbox server without requesting permission. A server I'd personally built and configured. That told me everything I needed to know. The decision hadn't been made over lunch. It had been executed long before, and the lunch was just a formality. A curtain over a stage already dismantled. Most people would have packed up that day. But I wasn't most people. I didn't yell, didn't send a dramatic farewell email, didn't so much as let my expression shift. I walked to my desk, smiled at Callum when he passed by, cocky in his slim-fit suit, looking like a character from a startup brochure, and opened a plain text document on my desktop. I started writing. Not a resignation, a roadmap, a sequence, everything I'd ever quietly prepared for a moment like this. Because the truth was, I'd always known they might try something like this. 2 months earlier, I had noticed a pattern. Someone had been accessing my codebase after hours. Not downloads, those could be tracked, but silent peeks. Studying my architecture, reading my logs, mirroring my workflows. At first I thought it was one of my junior devs, trying to learn, but the IPs traced back to the executive Wi-Fi network. That narrowed it down to 5 people. And 2 weeks later I caught Callum's username in a log review. Accessing restricted protocols through elevated credentials. Credentials he shouldn't have had. He had been given super user access before he was even introduced to the team. I smiled when I saw it. They weren't just replacing me, they were dissecting me. And the funniest part, they thought I didn't leave breadcrumbs. But my system didn't just run code. It watched. It listened. It recorded access anomalies in a place no one knew existed. A tool I named Substrate, tucked deep in a shell folder 5 directories deep under the name Lunch Menu. I copied the log files to an encrypted USB, walked outside and called the one person I knew I could trust, Giselle Tran. She'd been my lead systems engineer for 6 years and the only person who ever figured out how to optimize my pre-cache framework without needing to ask how it worked. "They've made their move," I told her. There was a pause. "Then what do you need?" "Loyalty," That's the word I'd forgotten still existed in corporate life. Meet me tomorrow. 6:30. Alara Cafe. No phone. That night, I walked past the Arrowin hangars, the scent of jet fuel and machine oil cutting through the Pacific air. Every piece of code, every system, every silent fix in the middle of the night. I'd done it because I believed in what we were building, and now they were gutting it for a boardroom pitch deck. I stopped walking and looked up at the blinking red warning light atop the tallest hangar. I wasn't angry. I was focused, and soon they'd understand exactly what they dismantled. Giselle was already at the cafe when I arrived. Hoodie pulled low, her eyes flicking up from a notebook as I sat across from her. "Tell me everything," she said without preamble. I slid the USB across the table under a napkin, keeping my voice low. "They've been copying my code. They gave Callum full access weeks before I knew he was even joining. They're not just replacing me, they're harvesting me." Her mouth tightened. She had seen the signs too. "He's asked me to prepare training modules on the predictive suite. Said it's too black box for him to optimize." I nodded. Of course he did. The predictive suite was never fully documented. Not because I was hiding it, but because it couldn't be taught from a manual. It worked off an adaptive engine I developed during my freelance years, using dynamic telemetry loops that evolved with input. "You don't explain intuition in a spreadsheet. I need you to do two things," I said. "First, quietly copy all user logs that touch the sandbox environment. Use the substrate hooks I taught you. Second, I want you to start logging any changes Callum makes to the core engine without him knowing." Giselle leaned back, eyes sharp. "You're setting a trap." I shook my head. "I'm collecting evidence. When this goes legal, and it will, I need a full map of who accessed what, when, and what they broke trying to improve it." She exhaled. "What's the end game?" I looked out the window for a long moment before answering. "I'm not taking them down out of spite. I'm just making sure they don't sell what doesn't belong to them." Back at the office, the vibe had shifted. People were polite, but distant. The kind of politeness that knows something's coming. My calendar had been stripped clean. No meetings, no tasks, no updates, just white space. Callum had taken over the morning huddles and was now calling himself CTD, Chief Tech Director, even though the role didn't officially exist. He handed out laminated cards with Arrowin's new digital vision, and asked the dev team to stop referencing legacy protocols. Legacy, of course, meant my work. I spent that week doing two things: being useful and disappearing. I offered help with onboarding, answered questions when asked, but I also backed up every line of code I had developed before Arrowin. Anything built pre-contract was technically mine, and in a quiet side office I began constructing an independent, streamlined version of the predictive suite, one that would run outside their servers. Giselle sent me the first log dump that Thursday. It was worse than I thought. Callum had copied entire sections of my private framework and started testing them in production environments without understanding the interdependencies. Friday evening as I left the office, I passed the server room. The door was ajar. Callum was inside, staring blankly at a frozen terminal. "Need help?" I asked. He startled, tried to act casual. "Just a bug in the cache engine. Probably your old code. Bit fragile." I smiled. "Yeah, sometimes the engine locks if someone runs an override out of sequence." He blinked. "Wait, what override?" I didn't answer, just tapped the screen twice, rebooted the process and walked out. He had no idea what he'd unleashed. By Monday morning, Callum's streamlined deployment had already caused 2 minor failures in the scheduling modules. Nothing catastrophic, just enough that the night crew lost sync with aircraft diagnostics and had to run everything manually. To the execs, it looked like normal hiccups. To me, it looked like a crack in the glass. I knew what came next. That's how systems fail, not all at once, but piece by piece. And Callum, for all his talk of innovation, didn't understand the architecture he was trying to control. That week, he summoned the entire tech team into a conference room for a future vision session. He clicked through a flashy presentation of buzzwords and promises. Artificial intelligence, cloud migration, predictive optimization. Everyone nodded, but I watched Giselle take notes. Not on his vision, but on his contradictions. He had no migration plan, no budget numbers, no API specs. Just ego dressed in ambition. "We'll be phasing out legacy systems by end of quarter," he said. "Expect a culture shift." I raised my hand. "Are we doing a sandbox test environment before rollout?" He waved it off. "No time. We'll optimize live." It was the perfect setup. The original predictive suite required a specific calibration tied to each aircraft's telemetry history. remove the calibration engine, and the predictions became noise. I knew what would happen. They'd try to modernize it by stripping it down. The suite would lose accuracy. Flight maintenance would fall behind. And with the Navy audit 2 weeks away, they were about to fly blind. But I wasn't there to stop it anymore. That wasn't my job. My job was to protect my work and prepare for the moment they realized what they'd done. Giselle and I met again that evening. This time in a quiet co-working space downtown, under the guise of contract consulting. She brought me a folder printouts, access logs, backup configs. Callum had already authorized changes to the code, but here's the twist. He'd also signed a vendor agreement with an outside firm, Lingate Solutions, claiming joint development rights to the predictive software. A firm that, surprise surprise, was run by one of his former classmates. He was preparing to sell my code. That was the line. Not the betrayal. Not the lies. The theft. They weren't just replacing me. They were trying to repackage what I'd created and profit from it. We have enough, I told Giselle. Time to make the move. I reached out to a patent attorney I knew in San Francisco and forwarded the original codebase I'd developed 5 years before joining Arrow One. Within 48 hours we filed a provisional patent. Not on the whole suite, just the engine core. The one piece they couldn't run without. The one piece they didn't understand. The next day, I called in sick. First time in 5 years. Sat at home and watched the servers quietly log the usage failures. 3 false positives, 2 missed predictions, and 1 aircraft maintenance delay. The tension would begin soon. I wasn't trying to crash the company. I just wanted them to feel the weight of what they'd tried to erase. And as I sipped my coffee and watched the logs blink red, I smiled for the first time in weeks. The storm was coming, and they didn't even see the clouds. By Thursday morning, word had started spreading across departments. Something was wrong with the predictive systems. Maintenance teams were running double checks manually. Delays were stacking up. One technician filed a report noting that a routine failure had gone unflagged, something that hadn't happened in over 5 years. Meanwhile, Callum stood in the break room talking about system overhauls and how the legacy code was too bloated to maintain. I passed by without speaking. I didn't need to. He was already sweating. That afternoon, Arrowwind's head of operations, Darlene Voss, called me into her office. She'd always been fair, old school, the kind of leader who remembered birthdays and read quarterly reports. "I know you're transitioning out," she said gently, "but I need to ask, is there a reason the system's missing alerts?" I kept my tone neutral. The new architecture stripped out the calibration module. It was never designed to run without it. Her eyes narrowed. "Did Callum know that?" "He had access to all documentation," I replied. That was true. He just didn't understand what he was looking at. That evening I opened my private server. Giselle had uploaded a series of internal emails, one of which was gold. A message from Callum to his friend at Lingate Solutions detailing his plan to rebrand the predictive engine as a co-developed platform. He even named it FlySight. I printed it out, added it to the growing file I kept in a locked drawer at home. Then I called a former Arrowwind board advisor, now consulting for a defense contractor. I pitched him a licensing idea, one that didn't involve Arrowwind at all. Friday morning, Arrowwind's internal audit team launched a quiet investigation. They'd been tipped off, likely by Darlene, after seeing too many exceptions in the maintenance logs. They pulled Callum into a closed-door meeting. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. By lunch, his tone had changed. He came to my desk, fake smile in place. "Hey Malcolm, mind sitting down with me later? Need help understanding a few things." I looked up at him and paused just long enough. "Of course," I said. "Happy to clarify." That evening I met Giselle again, this time with Luis, a systems specialist I'd mentored years ago. He still worked part-time on the fleet analytics module. When I explained what Callum had done, signing IP agreements behind the company's back, Luis swore under his breath. "He's selling it off before the audit." I nodded. "Wants to position it as his innovation." Luis shook his head. "Doesn't even know what half of it does." I opened my laptop. "Then let's show them what happens when you try to fly a plane with no instruments." That night we uploaded a secure test environment of the real predictive suite to my offsite server. Clean code, fully calibrated, and mine. I attached the provisional patent docs, the original Git logs, and screenshots of Callum's emails. Then I sent a package to Arrowwind's legal department, marked confidential. The email was simple. "You've built your future on stolen architecture. I suggest you verify who actually owns the wings you're flying on." Monday morning arrived like a loaded gun. At 8 a.m. the Arrowwind offices were buzzing. but not with the usual hum of meetings and coffee runs. Word had leaked that the Navy audit team had arrived a full week early. Unannounced. Quiet. Lethal. I saw Callum in the hallway. His face pale, lips tight. The swagger was gone. He clutched a notebook like a shield, whispering nervously with Marlon Avery outside the executive conference room. I passed them both and made my way to my old office. I wasn't scheduled for any meetings, but I knew they'd come calling. By 10:30 the first test had already failed. The auditors flagged a mismatch between reported maintenance alerts and actual hardware data. One of the aircraft flagged green, had a failing pressure valve. It should have been caught. The system didn't alert it. That system, a stripped version of my engine missing the very calibration module Callum insisted was outdated. I watched from my desk as one of the auditors made a quiet call, likely to naval procurement. Contracts don't tolerate preventable failures, especially not in defense. At noon, Marlon Avery himself entered my office. No invite, no greeting, just walked in like the building was on fire, which, metaphorically, it was. "Malcolm, we need to clarify a few things," he said, voice sharp around the edges. I motioned to the seat across from me, of course. "What do you need?" He sat, glanced around like he was expecting bugs on the walls. "The predictive suite. Some files have surfaced claiming it was your personal development, that you filed a patent." I handed him a folder. Inside were the dated Git logs, the licensing agreement, and a printed copy of Callum's email chain. He flipped through the papers in silence, each page heavier than the last. Finally, he closed it and exhaled like a man realizing he'd stepped into a trap, laid long ago. "Why didn't you come to us first?" I tilted my head. "I did. Years ago. You signed the original licensing agreement. It's in your email. I've archived it in case you need a refresher." His jaw tensed. "What do you want?" I kept my voice calm. "Recognition of ownership, a formal cease to the fly site rollout, and a licensing deal going forward, or full disclosure of Callum's actions to the auditors." By 3:00 p.m., I was called into a formal board session. Darlene was there. Giselle, too. Even Luis had been invited to provide technical context. Callum sat at the end of the table, trying not to sweat through his blazer. The head Navy auditor spoke calmly but firmly. "There are serious discrepancies in your systems. Your infrastructure relies on software not fully owned by Aerowin. This could be grounds for breach of contract." Marlon tried to smooth things over, but I raised my hand. "If I may," I said, "I'd like to explain how the predictive suite actually works and why it failed." I spent the next 15 minutes walking the board through the system's design, from telemetry modules to adaptive pre-caching. I didn't gloat. I didn't twist the knife. I just told the truth. At the end, the auditor looked at Callum and said flatly, "Did you understand any of that?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Silence. Cold, beautiful silence. And that was when I knew the shift had begun. Not in my favor, but in the truth's. Because the truth, when timed right, becomes a blade. By Wednesday morning, Callum was gone. Officially, he'd resigned to pursue other opportunities. Unofficially, he had been quietly escorted out after the board reviewed the full extent of his actions, including the vendor agreement with Lingate Solutions, the unauthorized code modifications, and the security risks his rollout had triggered. The Navy placed Aerowin under provisional review. The audit wasn't just about software anymore. It was about trust, and Callum had burned that to the ground before his career had even properly begun. Marlon tried to contain the fallout. He scheduled emergency town halls, sent out company-wide emails filled with phrases like temporary setbacks, strong partnerships, and resilient core. But none of it landed. Everyone knew the truth now. And the ones who'd been there since the beginning, Giselle, Luis, the hangar crews, they weren't asking questions, they were watching. Because the man they'd sidelined, the one they thought would go quietly, had just walked through fire without flinching. And on the other side of that fire was leverage. That same afternoon, I received a call from the Navy's technical division. They'd reviewed the documentation I'd provided, both the original source code and the provisional patent. Their lead systems officer wanted a meeting. "We're interested in licensing your full engine for broader use," he said. "Not through Aerowin, directly." The email confirmation came with a formal request. A standalone version of the predictive suite, one that could be deployed on other platforms. "We value systems built by those who understand the mission," the officer wrote. Translation: they trusted me, not the company I was leaving. At 5:42 p.m., I received one final email from Marlon. It was short, direct. "We've reviewed your licensing proposal. We accept the terms. Please coordinate with legal for next steps." No apology. No explanation, just quiet surrender from a man who had once called me a foundational pillar. I forwarded the email to my attorney and Giselle. Then I locked my office for the last time. The desk was empty, the shelves cleared, but my legacy wasn't made of furniture or files. It was made of systems, of proof, of moments when silence became strategy. The next morning, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment watching the fog roll in over the sound, I opened a folder labeled Phase 2. Inside were names good people still at Arrowin, people who'd quietly supported me. Vanessa, who handled aircraft telemetry like it was an art. Nolan, who could reverse engineer code blindfolded. I started making calls not to offer them jobs but opportunities. Because if there's one thing betrayal teaches you, it's who's worth building with again. And just as I finished sending the last offer, my phone buzzed. A message from Giselle. They're restructuring again. Darlene is taking over as interim CTO. She asked if you'd consult. I stared at the screen for a long moment, the ghost of a smile on my lips. The board had realized what they'd lost. And now, they wanted to rent back what they once had for free. Tell her I'm open to it, I replied. On my terms. 3 weeks later I walked back into Arrowin, but this time not as an employee, not as someone seated quietly at a desk while others stole credit. I walked in as an external systems consultant, escorted by Darlene herself. The offices looked the same, but the energy had changed. Colder, quieter. People glanced up as I passed, some nodding, some avoiding eye contact. I wasn't there to punish anyone, but they all knew what had happened. The company tried to erase me and ended up needing me more than ever. Darlene led me to a temporary office on the 3rd floor, the one with a view of the hangars. The board has signed off on your consulting contract, she said. We need the real suite back in place, intact, stable, audit-proof. Can you do it? I opened my laptop. Already done, I said calmly. The server is secured. The license is active. You'll have full access under the terms we agreed on. She gave a small smile. You planned all of this, didn't you? I met her eyes. No, I prepared. There's a difference. Later that afternoon I stood in the hangar watching one of our newer aircraft being serviced. Luis joined me, coffee in hand. You know, he said, there's a kind of poetry to all this. You built the engine. They tried to fly without you and now they're grounded until you say go. I chuckled. Poetic justice never shows up early. But when it does, it lands like thunder. We watched the mechanics run diagnostics using the original suite, fully licensed, every line of code singing with intention again. And no one but me could have made that happen. Within a month I had signed 2 more consulting contracts. One with the Navy, one with a logistics firm in Texas. My small firm expanded. Giselle came on full-time. Luis followed. Then Vanessa. We didn't just rebuild Arrowin systems, we started building new ones for others. Better, smarter, human-centered. And this time our names were on everything. No one owned our work but us. No handshakes in dark offices. No promises forgotten when convenient. Just clarity. Just value. The final thread came loose when I received an internal memo forwarded from an old friend still at Arrowin. Marlon Avery had stepped down. Official story? To pursue other ventures. Real story? He'd been pressured out after the board learned just how much of the tech backbone he'd tried to sell off under false pretenses. His name disappeared from the leadership page by the end of the week. I didn't cheer, didn't celebrate, just closed the browser and looked out the window of my new lakeside office. You don't always get to choose how they betray you, but you get to choose how you respond. Silence isn't weakness, it's strategy, especially when you know you're sitting on the kill switch. They thought I'd be another discarded asset, but what they failed to realize was simple. You don't fire the foundation and expect the building to stand.